We have here today the chair of the newly formed political party, the United States Humanist Party. This is Michael Felly. Welcome to this podcast. You stated earlier that the party stands for generational democracy. Would you like to explain, for our viewers, I've never really heard of generational democracy. What is that?
Well, generational democracy actually goes back to our forefathers, Jefferson, Madison, Thomas Paine, and John Cartwright, the father of political reform, actually discussed generational democracy in some detail. Jefferson is the more famous forefather discussing generational democracy, but Thomas Paine actually predates Thomas Jefferson by about 3 years. Jefferson is famous for saying, one generation is to another as one nation is to another. So basically, every generation is born and every generation dies. Our forefathers were born and our forefathers died. We had the Civil War generation. We had the World War II generation. So as one generation is entering retirement, they end up passing the baton, so to speak, to the next generation. And inevitably, one generation is going to leave and the other generation is going to take over. So basically, what you have in generational democracy is you have an equilibrium that exists between generations. And what millennials and Generation Z are feeling today is an imbalance in that equilibrium. So who we humanists are is we are going to be the catalyst that brings equilibrium back to American politics. So if you kind of think of it, on one side of an equation, you may have Generation Z and millennials, and then on the other side, you have the silent generation and the baby boomers. When the World War II generation was passing the baton, that occurred in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, the World War II generation gave the silent generation and the baby boomers, very low national debt, no federal balance sheet on the Federal Reserve, and there seemed to be very social tranquility in the 1980s. So what we see today is that there's an imbalance in generational democracy because we have policies that only favor the preceding generations at the expense of succeeding generations. So when you look at laws that are being passed today and in the past 40 years during their lifetimes, you see that there's been an imbalance in this equilibrium. And this imbalance has actually come at the expense of millennials and Generation Z. In fact, it's actually an infringement on their social, economic, and environmental liberty.
Oh, okay. Let's expand on this. These liberties you were talking about. You mentioned the infringement on social, environmental, and economic liberty. I was wondering, could you elaborate on economic liberty?
Well, as I mentioned, when the World War II generation passed their baton to the silent generation and the baby boomers in the 1980s, they gave those two generations only $1 trillion in national debt. There was no Fed balance sheet. Environmentally, the World War II generation was responsible for the depletion of the ozone layer with chlorofluorocarbons, but they fixed it. So as they passed the environmental end to the silent generation and baby boomers, there really wasn't very much an infringement. And the Federal Reserve could raise interest rates up to 20% in the 1980s. We can't even raise interest rates 1% as we speak. So the infringement actually is a playoff of a French Enlightenment philosopher called Voltaire. Voltaire is famous for saying the art of government is taking money from one class of citizens and giving it to another. These preceding generations, the silent generation and the baby boomers, tweaked Voltaire's maxim a little bit, and they figured out a way to take from the millennial generation to give to their generation before millennials were even born. And that's an infringement on the economic liberty of the millennials. And what millennials are seeing today is actually an argumentative fallacy. There's a fallacy that's called the Mott and the Bailey fallacy. And I will elaborate on that a little bit.
Please do.
Somebody in conversation may say that American capitalism works best with a laissez-faire approach to business, very little government intervention, and the invisible hand will solve all the problems. That's an assertion. If somebody challenges that assertion, if somebody comes forward and says, well, yes, but it certainly seems like the invisible hand is squeezing the middle class and preventing class mobility. That's a confrontation to that assertion. What millennials are witnessing is then that individual says, look, socialism and communism is not the answer. And nobody's even talking about socialism or communism. We concur socialism and communism is not the answer. So you're actually comparing, you're conflicting two arguments when you talk about the Mott and the Bailey fallacy. So to compare apples with apples and not apples to oranges, you don't compare American capitalism with socialism. You don't compare American capitalism with communism. In the United States, we've had 4 economic models in our time, all lasting approximately 40 years, ironically. The first economic model was the Gilded Age. That lasted between 1860 and 1900. The second economic model between 1900 and 1940 was the Progressive Era. In 1940 to 1980, we had the World War II generation economic model. And in 1980 to today, we have what's known as neoliberalism. That actually is their word, not mine. We humanists call what we see plutocracy capitalism because it favors the 1% at the expense of the middle class. So now you can actually compare these 4 models because these 4 economic models are capitalism. So you're comparing apples to apples. So we humanists have come up with a question that's called, what just happened to America? Okay? Because it certainly does seem like the middle class is being squeezed and class mobility has been stifled. So I'm going to go through that question rather quickly. Again, what just happened to America? W, wages. So as we know, wages have been stagnated since we took ourselves off the gold standard. And that's a very famous graph by the Economic Policy Institute where you can see wages have stagnated since the late 70s. So that's one thing that has happened to the middle class. What just happened to America? J, jobs. So what happened to the jobs in the United States of America? Well, it actually began with the corporate raider. And I'll give you an example of 2 corporate raiders, rather famous but fictional corporate raiders, is Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street and Edward Lewis from one of my favorite movies, Pretty Woman. Okay. These are corporate raiders. They come in, they chop up corporations, send the jobs overseas, and build condominiums and things like that on the property where these corporations used to be. We also have NAFTA, which many people, it's been in the news lately with Trump shipping jobs to Canada and Mexico. We have the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, which opened up an entire Eastern bloc in Europe, as well as Mother Russia as well. And then we have China. So that's where all the jobs went. And that's why millennials and Generation Z are feeling this pinch with, what just happened to America. Now going on to H, what just happened to America? H, healthcare. There's a two-pronged attack here with healthcare that it's affecting millennials and Generation Z. Employers are saddled with very high healthcare costs for their employees, and it continues to go up. So employers are hesitant to hire more employees because they have to pay the healthcare costs, and employers are hesitant to give raises to their employees because of healthcare costs. And then the employees themselves, when they go to the doctor, they pay outrageous out-of-pocket healthcare expenses. So this also helps, is one of the reasons why the middle class is being squeezed. What just happened to America? T. Well, every millennial knows college tuition is just going exponential. Back when the World War II generation passed the baton, my generation, Generation X, we could still go to school rather cheaply. I came out of undergraduate with less than $5,000 of debt, and I think the only reason why I even had some debt, I didn't really need it. I just took it just in case. Didn't know what would happen while I was in school. Now today, you have school teachers, nurses, accountants, chemists, the very bedrock of the United States, coming out with $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in debt, Adam. It's absolutely insane. Then you have what just happened to America? A, asset prices. So, one generation is telling another, well, go where the jobs are. And they are going where the jobs are. And what they're finding is housing prices are through the roof. And this is what Peter Schiff, for example, explains with what is happening with inflation, is you're seeing these massive inflation of home prices. So millennials, they go get a job, but they can't buy their first home because the home is the price is egregious, you see. So when we moved from the World War II model to neoliberalism is an invention, okay? They moved from the gold standard to a debt-based monetary system. So the backstop is actually, instead of gold, it's debt. What is one man's liability is another man's asset, okay? So think of it like this. When 1903, when the Wright brothers invented the airplane, simultaneously, they also invented the airplane crash. In the 1930s, at the University of Chicago, when Enrico Fermi and other scientists pulled out the nuclear rods of the reactor that they just built in a squash court in the University of Chicago and invented nuclear fission, they've also simultaneously invented the nuclear meltdown. And we've had 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. So every invention has consequences. So neoliberalism, which is a model, not the model, but a model of American capitalism, works for the 1% at the expense of millennials and Generation Z. And that is the essence of economic infringement.
So, are we witnessing history repeat itself? Are we going back to the 1920s? Is Herbert Hoover going to pop out and be like, here's the New Deal?
Well, not exactly. History doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes. For millennials and Generation Z, it's actually worse than the 1920s. In the 1920s, America had very little national debt. There was certainly no Federal Reserve balance sheet. The dollar, the US dollar, actually was pegged to gold, so it actually had real value. And the United States was a country of production. Today, we have almost a $30 trillion deficit. We have a close to $8 trillion Federal Reserve balance sheet. We have money, which is simply paper, a fiat currency. And the United States is actually a country of consumption. So when you add all of that up, we're actually worse today than we were in the 1920s, unfortunately.
That's interesting. But for millennials, like, why can't they fix their problems with the parties we have, either the Democrat or the Republican? Why do we need a third party? Why do the millennials need this so much?
This was actually noted back in the 1990s. There was a Democrat in the primaries running against Bill Clinton. When he was given an interview, Paul Tsongas, out of the state of Massachusetts, he was asked, do you think the United States would be better off with a three-party system? And Paul Tsongas quipped, I didn't even know we had a two-party system. And this was spoken back in 1992. So what millennials and Generation Z are witnessing is what's called a Hobson's choice. It's an illusion of choice in which only one thing is being offered. An example I can give is, imagine parents telling their children, say like 5 children, we're going to let you vote on vegetables for dinner. And your vegetable choices are creamed corn or whole kernel corn. Well, that's not really a choice. The parents actually picked those two for their children. And it doesn't really matter what the children pick, they're still picking corn as their vegetable. And that, in essence, is what Hobson's choice is. Now, if you look at our website, and I have it pulled up here.
Wonderful.
Is you are looking at what is truly happening is millennials have a choice between plutocracy democracy or plutocracy democracy. And no, I didn't slip up. I said that twice purposely. So if you look at plutocracy democracy with a biased lens, you will see Democrat. If you look at plutocracy democracy with a different biased lens, you will see Republican. But the wizard behind the curtain, so to speak, is still plutocracy democracy. So what is plutocracy democracy? Plutocracy democracy is our word for the present government of the United States. It's a government of the wealthy, by the wealthy, and for the wealthy via a hijacking of all aspects of American government. And this is what James Madison feared the most. Plutocracy democracy is actually using the tools of democracy to undermine democracy. The same thing that Hannah Arendt witnessed in the Weimar Republic Germany in the 1920s and early 30s. So you use what's available. You use dark money. You use gerrymandering. You use filibusters. You use executive authority. These are the tools that plutocracy democracy is using to undermine American democracy. So let's look at what Democrats and Republicans stand for. Now, what we humanists have done is we have gone back 40 years when this started, looked at what Democrats stand for, and then what laws they pass. Not what they said, mind you. Anybody can say anything. But what laws did they pass? And then we did the same thing with the Republicans. We looked at what the Republicans stand for, and then we looked at what laws did they pass. Don't be fooled by what people say. Anybody can say whatever they want. But the laws is what speaks volumes. So as you're looking at this picture, when we come down, and I will just read from the website. So Democrats, aka the liberals, aka the left, what do they stand for? They stand for strict regulations. They are opposed to monopolies, and they believe in progressive taxes so the wealthy pay more. What Democrats stand for. So as you can see, we have accumulated a substantial amount of laws that the Democrats passed that contradict those three core beliefs. So what about the Republicans? Okay. So Republicans call themselves the conservatives, aka the right. Republicans believe in less government, less spending, and lower taxes. They believe in a laissez-faire approach to business, and they believe in keeping Big Brother out of the private lives of ordinary citizens. Keeping Big Brother out of the lives of ordinary citizens. So what do we find when we look at all 40 years? Well, just the opposite. The laws that they pass do not jive with what their core tenets are. So at this point, you would actually be delusional to think that if you gave either Democrats 4 more years or Republicans 4 more years, that they're going to fix this. In fact, Adam, today as we speak, the oldest Congress in American history is the Congress that we presently have. We elected the oldest president that this country has ever had. So you can see that this is very well tilted towards the silent generation and the baby boomer generation. And when you look at the laws of plutocracy, democracy, it comes at the expense of millennials and Generation Z. And that is an infringement, and that is what generational democracy is about.
That's a very interesting website. Is there anything else? What else can you share?
Well, let's go. At the top, you'll see that we have our core tenets and the party platform. The core tenets of the United States Humanist Party is our foundation. And the party platform is who we are as a party, which centers on 3 vital aspects of American democracy. 1, the middle class. James Harrington was very instrumental in writing Oceana, talking about the middle people being vital to the stability of the republic. 2, the dangers of party politics over country. And lastly, what is known as foreign influence, placing the interests of foreign countries above the United States of America. In fact, if you were to read George Washington's farewell address, I would say 2/3 of his farewell address is a warning against the power and danger of foreign influence. And to give you just one little tidbit, this 2020 election that we just had, there was over $14 billion, $14 billion spent in this election by special interest groups and anonymous donors.
$14 billion. That's quite a lot. Well, I believe that's all the time we have for today. I would like to thank you.
I would like to add one thing, if I may.
Absolutely.
On our website, we discuss plutocracy, democracy in great detail. Now, we are talking about the power players, the people in Washington. We're not talking about your neighbor who may be of the silent generation or your neighbor who may be a baby boomer, but the people who are pulling the strings. So in addition to our core tenets and party platform, we have what's called an indictment to plutocracy, democracy. So on our homepage, we discuss the national debt, climate change, what's really going on in Washington, their economic model they call neoliberalism, we call plutocracy, capitalism, the middle class, the war on terror, the opioid crisis, or what some have suggested, an opioid genocide, infrastructure, entitlements, and public education. So we humanists and millennials have accumulated all of this data and have now presented it as, metaphorically speaking, as an indictment, and as we humanists are acting as prosecutors, so to speak, on this website.
Well, thank you again. I really appreciate all the time you spent with us, sharing us your party, showing us your website, what the Humanists are. Anything else to add before we wrap this up?
Bob, there's a famous poem by Dylan who he wrote to his dying father. And if I can borrow that poem and make reference to Lady Liberty, to prevent Lady Liberty from dying, my advice to millennials is do not go gentle into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light. Lady Liberty now turns her worried eyes to the millennials.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael Felly of the Humanist Party.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
All right.